Scott, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll start with some introductions. My name is Klieger. I'm one of the Senior Associate Directors here in Career Services. This event is Networking During a Pandemic, and I'm delighted to have Scott Rubenstein join us this evening or afternoon or morning, again, whatever time zone that you happen to be tuning in for this event from. I've had the pleasure of knowing Scott for several years, worked with him closely when he was an undergraduate at Penn, and we wanted to have him talk through this topic of networking with us, because it's something that we know is an issue that many students find uncomfortable, find difficult to approach. It can be an intimidating kind of thing. And I remember when you yourself felt this way as an undergrad, and we had conversations about it. And Scott then has worked on this and processed it and has become quite adept at networking. And in fact, after he graduated, he wrote a book, which we'll talk about, and Milan will put a link to the book in the chat for anybody who is interested in, checking out his book on Amazon. It's available for anybody who wants it, but we have him here to share his tips. And before we even get into that, I know that Scott wanted to start off by sort of honoring somebody who's been a mentor in his life and to sort of showcase the importance of contacts and the power of connections and conversations. Susan Haas. So did you want to say something about Dr. Haas, Scott?
Yeah. Dr. Susan Haas is a professor at the Annenberg School of Communication. I graduated from Penn last year with a major in communication, and she taught the internship class at Penn. And I had the pleasure of working with her in my last semester at Penn when I had an internship in New York City. We got the news today that she tragically and unexpectedly passed away. And we're devastated to hear that. Dr. Haas was a really, really amazing professor, a really, really supportive mentor to me and to many Annenberg students, and was a really big part of being able to allow students the opportunity to pursue their professional goals, while also sort of marrying that with the academic study of communication at Annenberg. She's been a very big part of my journey, and so very sad to hear this news, and we will miss her, and wanted to acknowledge her at the beginning of this talk.
Yeah, thank you for doing that, Scott. Much appreciated. Sounds like she was amazing. I unfortunately didn't have the chance to work with her at Penn, but I know she touched many lives during her tenure here. So again, thanks for joining us. Did you want to say a little bit about yourself and your own journey?
Yes, for sure. So my name is Scott Rubenstein. I graduated from Penn last year in 2019. Like I said, I majored in communication with a concentration in political communication and a minor in political science. My primary professional interest has been the film and television entertainment industry. I spent a lot of time sort of pursuing that career goal all throughout college. I had several internships both in Los Angeles as well as New York. And after I graduated from college, I moved to Los Angeles and started working at a film and television talent management and production company. And networking was a really big part of being able to jump into that world of Hollywood. And so that is sort of where I'm at now.
Great, thank you. So Scott, why don't we just start by having you explain a little bit about when you first kind of realized that networking and building a community was important. Can you tell us briefly a couple of examples where networking made a difference in your own life?
Yeah. So I've actually always been interested, by the idea of social networks, how people know each other, 6 degrees of separation, all that great stuff. It wasn't until I got to Penn that I really began to realize how important it is in pursuing professional goals. When I was interested in the entertainment industry, and I started looking into internships and stuff, I realized that a lot of those opportunities are really only available to people who know somebody who can help them out. Um, and then, so it became something that I realized was like essential to your professional development, and it's really important for your education too. I had the opportunity, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, to do informational interviews with many Penn alumni, and I learned a lot about the way my desired industry works that I wouldn't have known otherwise. So it's really important to be able to help and learn from other people when you're pursuing your goals. And it works out in ways that are very unexpected. For example, my current roommate that I have in Los Angeles, I got to him through networking. When I was a sophomore in college, I spoke to a Penn alum who's an assistant to a television showrunner, and he suggested that I look into his boss's management company for an internship. This is a company that didn't have a website. I would have never heard of them otherwise. And so a generous alum connected me to that company. I had an internship there, and I met this guy who was a fellow intern, and we kept in touch, and then we became roommates. So that all happened over the course of years, of course, because of this one Penn alum who I spoke to on the phone for an informational interview. And another example, the job that I currently have, it started with one of my cousins who just happened to go to college with somebody who now is the CEO of the website and production company Funny or Die. One of the summers I was in LA, my cousin connected me to him for an informational interview. I went and met him, and then a year later, when I moved to LA looking for a job, I emailed him and he connected me to somebody who works at the company I work at now. So you never know where these things come from, but it's important that these were really big, life things that happened to me, a job, an apartment. And they came from people that I really didn't know at all / didn't know very well. So that's a really important part about the power of networking, is that, people that you don't know really well can have a huge impact, which is amazing.
And that you never know where those conversations may lead, and something that starts off really small could turn into something big, even if you don't have an intention for it to go somewhere at the time. Yes, I mean, what do you think a lot of people find kind of networking, I think, intimidating, because they think about it as something that has to be, orchestrated, or you talk in the book about how it has to be, people have this misconception that it's transactional. What is what about that misconception? What do you think people get wrong about networking that makes it feel icky or unapproachable to people?
So it's a great question. And that's really the reason I wrote the book, was to sort of destigmatize and reframe this. And I can understand why people sort of would have negative feelings about networking if they think of it in a very transactional and self-serving way. And that is unfortunately often the way people utilize networking. Networking is really about building a community. This is how I define it in the book: building a community of supportive collaborators and allies with common interests who desire to share in each other's success. And when you look at it this way, it's not about, a quid pro quo, I do this for you, you do this for me, and we move on with our lives. It's really about having genuinely meaningful relationships with people who care about you and people that you care about. And you'll be able to help each other with your goals. And I think that people also, they think of it as something that's kind of very scary, something they don't know how to do, they're not very good at it. I've heard all those things before. It's actually something that is so very natural to us, something we do every single day without realizing it. Because if you think about it, right, every conversation you have with everyone you know is networking, because that's what networking is. It's building relationships with people. So when you're talking to your family, to your friends, to your community members, you're either building or maintaining some sort of relationship with those people, right? So that's really what it is. And, you know, it's a little bit, when we're talking about doing informational interviews and reaching out to new people, it's a little bit of a different form of networking, but it's still that human to human relationship and leveraging your network, right? Like asking someone to help you with something. People do that all the time too. If you've ever asked a friend for an opinion, a recommendation for somewhere to travel to or a place to eat, if you've been in a debate with someone and asked a third person to settle it, those are all examples of utilizing the people in your network to help you learn or grow or find something new in some way. So it
It's
really
kind of
is.
like crowdsourcing.
Exactly. It's a really very natural part of being human and you know, being with other people. Um, but if not done the right way, it can be very scary and intimidating, and something that is a turnoff. So I can understand where that comes from, but it's really a very natural part of life, in my
So
opinion.
for people, you know, if you, you know, feel like you have people who are already well connected and in positions of of power, who you know well in your life, I think the concept of approaching someone and asking them for a favor or asking for information may feel a little easier. You know, but there are plenty of students. I know, you know, my colleague Milan, who's also on this session, and I all the time hear from students who say, I'm not well connected. I'm not one of these, you know, privileged Penn students that, you know, whose father is, you know, CEO of this, or who his uncle, you know, is well connected, you know, on this other board. I don't have family members like that. I don't have a network. So what do you say to people who feel like they don't have these kinds of connections that could be beneficial to them? Where do they start?
So that's a great question. First of all, I would say to anybody who says that they don't have a network, it's not true. You do have a network, because every single person that you know, from even your parents all the way out to every classmate you ever had, everyone in your family, friends circle, your relatives, everyone is part of your network. Now, that's, I think, a different question from the idea of like who is in your network, right? And that admittedly is an inequitable system. So it is true that some people, and it does relate to your level of often your socioeconomic privilege, there are some people that are sort of born into having more access to some people than others. And I totally understand that. You know, for example, I didn't grow up in Los Angeles. I don't have any relatives that are big movie producers. And so it wasn't that easy for, you know, for me to achieve my goals. But I do have relatives who, you know, went to college, who have graduate degrees, who, you know people. And so it, you know, to be fair, it was somewhat easier, you know, for me to leverage that network. I think that it's really important, no matter where you are, to still do the work. And I understand that it is harder for some people than others based on sort of where you're starting from. Um, but you can do it, and you do have a place to start. You're not starting from nothing, because everybody knows somebody. Um, and at Penn, you have a lot of access to a lot of really great people, which we'll, you know, dive into a little bit later. Um, but not having a network is not a thing. You most certainly do. Even if you're the network that you're starting with may not be as helpful to you in that moment as maybe some other people's are to them.
Yeah, great. I think that's really important to acknowledge too, that not everyone's kind of starting from the same place, and not everyone may have, you know, the same level of comfort. Um, what advice then do you have for folks who may feel like they have additional barriers to networking based upon their identity or affinity? And how might they go about the networking process?
So a few things on this. I always say for Penn students that QuakerNet is the great equalizer, right? No matter, sort of where you're coming from, if you are a Penn student, you have access to QuakerNet. QuakerNet, of course, is the online Penn alumni network that has information for virtually all living alumni. You can search by name, you can search by city, by career field, by company, and you can contact them for informational interviews. I've done it many, many times, and it can be very fruitful. LinkedIn is another great way to do this using Penn alumni. Now, some people, as we're talking about, do maybe feel like they have some extra challenges, sort of based on their background. What I would say to that is, first of all, I'm obviously sort of limited in how much I can speak to that. I'm very clearly, a white man. But I know that I have friends who, are people of color, LGBT people. They have a lot of organizations out there that are helpful to people from various communities specifically. I looked it up before so I could remember. One of my friends from Penn was involved in this organization called Management Leadership for Tomorrow, which helps connect Black, Latinx, and Native American students to various companies and professionals to help them advance their career goals. And I know that for a lot of people, if you are underrepresented in the career field that you're going into, other people who share your identity will be especially helpful and especially willing to chat with you and teach you what they know. A lot of major companies have organizations within their companies for people with various backgrounds, for Black people, for LGBT people, et cetera, to connect and to network. So what I would hope is that, people start to think about their identities as tools that can help them in the networking game. They have extra special opportunities rather than it being a barrier in some way, which I understand. I mean, obviously I can't fully understand, but I know that there are extra barriers and challenges, but there are also very special and unique opportunities too that I hope people will take advantage of.
Yeah, great. Certainly there are definitely, special affinity groups and lots of professional organizations. And I completely echo that depending upon your identity and affinity group that you seek out those opportunities to engage, just as Scott said, with shared affinities as a way to, empower yourself as part of the search. So I think that's a great tip, Scott. Okay, so you talked a little bit about QuakerNet and LinkedIn. Are there other tools that you would recommend as part of the networking search process?
This is not necessarily an online tool, but using second degree connections is really, really important. So when we were talking a little bit earlier about, who's in your network already, literally everybody that you know is in your network. And if you don't know somebody directly, ask around to your family, to your friends, to your professors, to your high school teachers, to your high school friends. People have their own networks, and you'd be surprised at the number of people that you can be connected to through mutual friends and mutual connections that you already know. I think beyond QuakerNet, that's actually like a primary way to do networking, friend of a friend type stuff. I've gone through this many times myself in my networking journey, and I've had the opportunity to connect with even third and fourth degree connections, which is so interesting when I end up on the phone with somebody and they're like, how do you know such and such? And I'm like, well, actually, I have only spoken to them one time because we have a mutual friend or someone that they connected me to and I have a mutual friend. And so you're now the fourth degree removed. And that's what's really so fun about the networking game is everybody's so connected. But I would definitely start
6 degrees of seven of Kevin Bacon, right?
exactly. So I would definitely start with like the people that you already know, because that like they can be helpful in ways that you don't even realize it. You just have to ask.
And one of the things that you mentioned is in terms of a way to end a conversation too, which we can talk about in terms of following up with people, is that's one of your tips is which I always tell people to do too, is to use that as a way to sort of create additional connections, right? Like who else could I could I talk to? Would you recommend that, this has been so helpful, given what we've discussed, who else do you think would be a good person for me to meet with? And I think that's such sage advice, and it's a way to sort of leverage their connections, but also their expertise and make them feel good about the people that they know, and expand your network in the process.
Absolutely.
Just like you said. So you talked about sort of informational interviewing as one of the key areas that, key strategies, and that information gathering is part of what you do to make it feel less transactional. I know we push informational interviewing a lot in our office, and I find, initially when we talked about this, people sort of go, uh-huh. And then they kind of say, and what is this exactly? So
Yeah.
Can you define informational interviewing and why you think it's important?
Yeah,
and what makes that distinctive?
Yeah, this is very, very crucial. This is like the center. I think this is like the centerpiece of all of networking, as a college student. An informational interview is really just a conversation that you have with somebody about their life, their career path, what they do in their job, their industry, to primarily learn about what they do, and so they can be helpful in your own life, but also make a new connection with a new person. And this is how, and let's get into this because this is really important. This is how you build your network. This is what you do with those second degree connections and your third degree connections and the people that you contact on LinkedIn and QuakerNet, right? Like you have to be able to initiate a relationship and then actually have one. And the way to do that is by having a conversation with people about, their background. And this is really important as well, because this is when you're talking about connecting with new people and asking them for something, this is the thing that you can ask for, because this is something that people will be willing to do. One of the reasons that people don't like networking is because they think it's self-serving to reach out to someone and ask a complete stranger to help them get a job, right? Like if I reached out to a Penn alum on QuakerNet and was like, hey, I saw you work at this company I really want to work for. I applied to this job. Can you like help me out? Help me get this job. There's no goodwill there. They don't know you. You're a stranger. There's no reason that they would want to help you. But if you reach out instead and say, I'm very interested in what you do. I would love to learn more. I'm interested in this field as well. I would love to learn more about you and about your career. People are very generous, but they also love to talk about themselves. And it's really not a big ask to have that conversation. And this is how relationships form, right? Like I've had many phone calls with people who talk about themselves for the vast majority of the call because that's the purpose, and I'm asking them questions, and they find they like me at the end, even though I haven't really said much, but I've given them—
True. This happens all the time.
Right, exactly, because I've given them the opportunity to talk about them, and I've been interested in them and wanting to learn from them. And so the call often ends with them saying, like, if I can ever be of any help, let me know, right? So these are ways to primarily to learn, and also to build your network in a way that's authentic, and shows that you are interested and care about other people. And if you show that, then they will be interested and will care about you as well.
So two quick follow-ups to this before we open it up to questions. I will hear from students who sort of say, I don't understand what the point of this is. So I have these conversations with people and I let them talk about themselves, but I'm not really sure what it does for me. Like if I already know a little bit about the industry and I hear about their path, fine, but I don't really see what the point is. And two, how do you then, if you have a good conversation, because they don't understand what the, if there's not much in the short game, how do you maintain the relationship so that they can see value in the long game?
Yeah, two really important things. So the first one, I would say that you never really know like who is going to become really impactful and meaningful in your life, right? Like I've probably done between 80 and 100 informational interviews in the last 3 years of my life. I've kept in touch, some better than others. Some didn't turn out to be very helpful. One led to me indirectly, again, having a roommate to live with, right? So you just never know. And I think that there's value. I think everybody has something to offer, and I think there's value in having those opportunities to connect with people and develop a relationship and expand your network. I'm not sure if I answered that question fully.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing I tell people is if you're interested in their organization, understanding the nuances of that person's path or experience, or what sorts of things have been impactful in their career there, means that you now have anecdotes that you can share if you ever interview at that organization, that you know sort of what buzzwords or key areas of interest, and it helps you personalize your own application or your interview answers so that you look like a more prepared candidate, A, and B, even if there's nothing available at the organization right now, you're a known entity down the road if something does become available. So then, let's say this person can't recommend you for something or nothing exists at the moment. As you said, you never know. So if in 6 months or in 2 years, something crops up, that person might say, oh, I remember talking to Scott. He was great. We should totally interview him. And your name is going to jump out of all those others, on the pile, just because you had that conversation before, and they're going to recognize who you are.
Right. Of course, absolutely. And the other piece of the question, right, was, once you
staying in touch. Yeah.
You do. Okay, this is a really, really crucial part of networking, right? Because when you're talking to people like this that you're going to be reaching out to through connections, often they're older, they are very busy and have very important jobs. They don't really know you very well. And so they're not going to make much of an effort, unless they're really nice, they're not going to make much of an effort to keep in touch with you. Not because they don't want to, but because you're just not on top of mind. So it's really incumbent upon you to make the effort to keep that relationship alive. And there's a bunch of considerations here. First of all, after you're done with your informational interview, you should definitely write a thank you note, and write a really a thoughtful thank you note, identifying specifically what you got out of the conversation and thanking them for their time and speaking with you, so they know what kind of an impact that they had on you. If you're talking to somebody, this is like a very specialized thing, but if you're talking to somebody that has an administrative assistant or a scheduler that helped schedule your conversation, I always write them a thank you note as well, to thanking them for helping set up the conversation.
Such a good idea.
I've been on the other side of that. I've worked as an administrative assistant, and it is a very thankless job. And so I think you'll really stand out if you do that, if you're in that situation. These people are often the gateways to their bosses, and often in the future become the boss themselves. And so it's important it's another way to maintain a strong relationship and really stand out. If you have a conversation and there's some sort of outstanding action item, always follow through and actually do it, and follow up and let them know that you did it. And these can be really small things. Since I'm in the entertainment industry, I've had many conversations with people where they've recommended a TV show that I should watch. And so I will watch the show, and then I will write them again and let them know that I took their recommendation and I enjoyed the show. A lot of people say, you know, let me know how it goes, right? Like that's a bit of a throwaway line if there's some sort of recommendation. They may not expect you to let them know how it goes. Do it. Follow up. Take every opportunity that you have to stay in contact. Following through and following up is something that really not a lot of people do, and it's a really small thing that can help you stand out. Beyond that, there's keeping in touch with a new contact is really an art form, and it's a balancing act, because yes, it's incumbent upon you to be able to keep that relationship alive, but you can also overdo it very easily and sort of destroy some of the goodwill that you've built up by being a little bit annoying. So it's really important, and this is not something that I like have an exact answer for. It's something that you have to feel yourself. But there's a very fine line there between, keeping in touch just the right amount and overdoing it. There are many ways that you can keep in touch. I have friends that like to send articles to their contacts, one, if they're mentioned in it, or two, just if it's something that they think will be of interest based on the conversation that you had. That again is something that I would say do very sparingly. People don't need to get articles from random contacts every week or two. A lot of people say that the holidays are a great time to keep in touch. You can write a note, saying happy holidays. And when I was in Philadelphia at Penn, I spoke to a lot of people in LA because that's where I wanted to work. And then I went to LA over the summer for internships, and I followed up with the people that I had informational interviews with and asked if we could grab coffee or meet in person. So in those situations, there's ways to do that. But it's definitely an art form, as I said, and something that once you do it and you'll get the hang of it, you'll figure it out, because it's just like having any kind of relationship with anyone else. But
it should be a two-way street and a conversation, and just
yeah.
like anything else, you want to be in touch, but not too much. You
Right.
also don't want it to be radio silent, so it's finding that balance, right?
Yeah, and yes, I agree. It should be a two-way street, but also it is, at the beginning at least, incumbent upon you to initiate that. I would not expect these people to be thinking of you on their own and reaching out on their own. Yeah.
Yes. I guess I mean a two-way street in the sense that you shouldn't be expecting them to just be giving you all the information, that you should be initiating and sending them things. So if you see an article or something, or if you write, like, that's what I mean by two-way
100%.
street. Not that you should be expecting them to follow up with you necessarily. So we did title this how networking during a pandemic, and I realized that we haven't yet really talked about how networking is different during COVID and in a virtual space. How might people think about approaching these conversations, or just networking in general, differently right now?
Yeah. I personally think that networking during a pandemic is not that different than before the pandemic. Obviously, in-person meetings are not really a thing right now, but a lot of the informational interviewing, that kind of thing, keeping in touch, can all be done virtually. For me, I did most of that virtually anyway, because I was speaking to people on the West Coast when I was in college and informational interviewing. but it is important that, this is a very difficult time for a lot of people, and everybody is sort of dealing with it differently and has different situations. So it's important to sort of be respectful and understanding, because some people are working from home and have kids that they have to take care of who are in online school while at home. See, Claire's raising her hand. And I've heard this before from colleagues and friends that like the boundaries at work right now, it's something that people are working on, because everybody knows that everybody's home most of the time, right? Like people think that people should be available all the time. And obviously, like, that's a little bit unreasonable. People need to sort of have time to decompress and can't always be on. So definitely be respectful of that, and, be considerate. There are the lines between work and home are really blurred right now. One of my colleagues at work said that it's not so much that we're working from home, but we're living at work, which I thought was very instructive and true. So that's a really important part of this, is that it's just a really difficult time for a lot of people. One tip that I like, and I think this applies both to being in the pandemic and not being in the pandemic as well, is when you're trying to schedule a phone call with somebody who's in a different time zone than you are. I like to always offer times in their time zone. I just think it's nice and accommodating. It has confused people before. It has confused people before, because I guess they think that I'm, thinking in my own time zone, which most people do. But I think there's things you can do like that to be considerate and accommodating in the pandemic.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think being respectful of the fact that for everyone's situation is different. So some people may have more time and are eager to be occupying themselves or distracting themselves with conversations in different ways. Other people may be feeling overwhelmed and have less time. So sort of being willing to meet people where they're at, and I think being flexible and understanding of wait times for responses. If you send out an email into the world asking for a meeting, I would say give it a week before you send a reminder saying, just wanted to see if you'd had a chance. I'm sure you're really busy to see if you'd had a chance to see this before you follow up.
That reminds me of one thing that I was going to say before in the previous question, which is that when you're reaching out to somebody who doesn't respond immediately, what do you do in those situations? My rule, if I'm reaching out to someone for an informational interview, for example, and they don't reply, I follow up 1 week later. I give them the full week, and then I write again, and you said, hi, just like want to make sure you saw this, looking forward to connecting. And that is the only time that you get to do that. After that, then you just have to like move on. They clearly aren't available. But that often works. There's a lot of times where I've followed up with somebody and they've been like, thank you so much for following up. I don't know how I missed this. I'm happy to talk to you, right? And they're very appreciative that you followed up. So definitely do that, but only do it the one time. And then that's it. People don't want to be hounded.